So when media outlets and journalists are not busy comparing every new release titles to Dark Souls or writing clickbait or dumb articles, they fill up their time hyping games to such insanity to the point that only a 9 or a 10 out of 10 is acceptable. Let's not forget, IGN gave Cyberpunk a 9 out of 10.
Cyberpunk 2077 kicks you into its dazzlingly dense cityscape with few restrictions. It offers a staggering amount of choice, and your decisions can have a tangible impact on both the world and people around you. Those stories can be emotional, funny, dark, exciting, and sometimes all of those things at once.
Or GameSpot gave the same score to Dark Souls 2. Well, I guess that aged like milk. To say that review scores are inflated is quite an understatement. The general perceptions on scores is so distorted that only a 9 or a 10 constitute a worthy score, especially for these large AAA highly anticipated games. Anything below can raise suspicions or even anger the fans. Obviously, certain biases must be taken into consideration here. In the case of From Software, I still think they still receive a pretty large amount of preferential treatment, considering the fact the same issues that plague their games are still present or have gotten even worse. So many reviewers are still on the fence and rather shy addressing any type of criticism, especially considering how sensitive to criticism some of its fan base tends to be. Elden Ring is another great addition on the hyped list of masterpieces that turn out to be good or even great games that I enjoyed, but with a shit-tons of problems that are just brushed under the rug by many people. I mean, let's be serious, words such as masterpiece or even genius have been so overused to the point they don't really mean much nowadays. Which brings us to Elden Ring. Now that some time has passed since its release date and the honeymoon and infatuation period has slowly dissipated, I think it's time to look at this game and see what actually does well and not so well. But before starting my analysis, maybe like, comment, subscribe, would be really much appreciated and helps my channel get noticed by the algorithm gods. So let's start with the story. Elden Ring presents a world in a state of decay and chaos due to devastating events that took place before. Then there's Queen Marika, who has many children that rule over different parts of the world, who all desired power and the shard of the Elden Ring. You take the role of a chosen undead, bearer of the curse, ashen one, tarnished one, you know the drill. Who are people that have been cast out only to return motivated by a grand purpose and fulfill their destiny, which boils down to kill a bunch of corrupted lords. So yeah, there are plenty of similarities and parallels to their previous games. From the way NPCs speak to plenty of other tropes, concepts and themes present in those games were pretty much carried into this one. You have another maiden who has pretty much the same personality as the previous ones.
Are you the next monarch? Or merely a pawn of fate?
The monumental awaits the above. The monumental will explain the nexus to thee.
Welcome to the bonfire, unkindled one. I am a firekeeper. I tend to the flame, and tend to thee.
I can play the role of maiden, turning runes into strength.
Hey, maybe it's my fault for expecting something a bit more different at this point, especially since it's a new IP and it was marketed as a collaboration with George R. Martin, which got me pretty excited, I have to say. Sekiro proved that From Software can flex their muscles and do something a bit different in terms of storytelling, even though there's still some Dark Souls DNA in it. Anyway, for me this formula becomes a bit stale and repetitive at this point. Keep in mind, this is From Software's 6th game, if we don't count Dark Souls 2, and during this time the only improvement they made to NPCs you encounter is this: closer, closer.
Able to cross the scarlet swamp of Aeonia. Don't fret, I'll provide. Should you accept, I will teach you the secret of Celia.
I mean, yeah, they move their lips and not even on sync with the sound. Here's the thing, From Software seems to be extremely capable of animating stuff. Look how insane some of the movesets enemies have, yet NPCs have received so little attention. They are just basically talking statues or puppets.
The tale of House Hoslow is told in blood. I, Dialos, swear to deliver the message.
Some more facial expression and gestures could do so much in order to offer each NPC more personality and actually make me more invested. From Software, for the most part, always had a minimalistic approach to the story, and Elden Ring is no exception to that, except this one might be their most cryptic and obtuse one yet. I was like 50 hours into this game and I still had no idea what the story was about. I didn't even knew what exactly is the Elden Ring. Dark Souls, vague as the story is overall, does a much better job to set up the stage right from the beginning.
But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold.
By the way, the intro from Elden Ring, it's gotta be the most underwhelming intro from any From Software game. I mean, what the hell happened? They used to have such impactful and epic cinematics, and now all we've got is just a bunch of slideshows, with a narrator that tries so hard to overly compensate the lack of any animation.
And Sir Gideon Othmere, the all-knowing.
Now in Elden Ring, there are plenty of fantastic and intriguing locations, which raised my curiosity and really made me want to know more, but there's so little information around that I kinda gave up in many places and then just started googling things. The game has entire buildings with books and shelves all around, yet all you can do is just roll over them. This random bookshelf from Skyrim has more things to read than the entire study hall entrance library, which has none. In the past, From Software managed to experiment a bit more in terms of storytelling with Sekiro. I really like the option to eavesdrop enemies and NPCs, and gather more contextual information about the state of the world and things that are happening.
Oh, ここを開けやがれ。こそこそと隠れてんのは分かってんだ。
Now, I've seen some people praising the lack of quest markers and how little the game holds your hand, so to speak. In certain aspects, the lack of hand-holding is to be admired, but in other cases does more harm than good. After talking to an NPC, which might give you a task to complete, it's extremely easy to forget critical information or what you're supposed to do in the first place, especially when the game is filled with so many distractions along the way. For example, after I found the blue lady, it's been like 60 to 70 hours until I saw her again. By that time, I almost forgot everything about her and what was her story. This happened to me to almost every single character that I've met. There are also instances where I found some item someone required by simply exploring the world. But again, since so much time has passed between me taking the job and finding that item, I kind of completely forgot why it was needed in the first place. Some journal or even a quest log which keeps track of all your NPC's progress should have been added, because honestly, this way of delivering quests is very disjointed and random. Now, in the previous From Software games, finding NPCs and following their quests was a bit easier due to its more linear structure, although I would argue even there a journal could help. But Elden Ring now it's an open world, which makes extremely frustrating and time-consuming anything regarding quests and NPCs. Then there's the whole quest markers debate. Does Elden Ring need a quest marker? Now Yatse makes some interesting points in one of his videos, but there is one section where I have to disagree a bit.
Players are firmly handheld through linear plot missions taking you to beauty spots A, B and C, aggressively broadsided with tutorials everywhere they go, or there'll be something like the Horizon Forbidden West thing, where the main character is always very pointedly mumbling about how nice it would be to do some sightseeing before the next plot bit. And since Jiminy Cogthroat is by definition game mechanic stew, and we can't risk the players missing any information related to that either, these games are usually absolutely plastered with excessive menus, icons and GUI elements.
He seems to conflate things a bit here. While an unguided exploration locking in markers is fantastic and more open world games need it, I'm not really sure story missions can work in the same way. So why the hell do we need quest markers in the first place? Well, I think it all has to do with the pacing. Every quest at the end of the day is a story. That's why linear games are so good at telling more cohesive stories, since the levels you explore and the numbers of distractions is limited. The linearity of those games guides the player, so you don't really need quest markers that much. In open world games, things are more complicated, since you can explore in any direction, and oftentimes you get lost or easily get distracted by other things. So ultimately, a quest marker attempts to achieve that linearity and focus, which is required for a proper pacing. Imagine, for example, Witcher 3. After talking to the Baron, you are just left wandering without any clear direction or a journal to keep track of your progress, hoping at one point you land on the next thing you have to do. I'm pretty sure the impact of that quest will be greatly diminished. Now, the way quest markers are presented can vary, sometimes highlighting that area is enough and letting the player explore for a bit, like in Red Dead Redemption 2. Assassin's Creed Valhalla on the other hand gives the player only written direction sometimes. Then once you approach that specific region, you can use the bird to locate the exact point. And then there's Morrowind, where you can waste more time finding the damn place than the time it takes to complete the actual quest. Anyway, the point is, quest markers in whatever shape or form they may come, I think at the end of the day are a good thing for people who want to focus and experience the story for a while, and not just waste time randomly roaming around. Okay, now let's talk about the open world. There is a trend lately where people have become so obsessed comparing Elden Ring to Ubisoft's style of open world, to the point they kinda disregard and ignore its many problems. I mean, Elden Ring is so handcrafted, surely doesn't have copy and paste content, right? Right? Don't get me wrong, I really enjoy the fact From Software decided to take a different approach, and not straight up borrowing from Ubisoft cookbook recipe that so many open world games have been doing for so many years. Rather, they decided to take a different direction, one that is not really new at all at the end of the day, but rather more or less forgotten. Actually, Bethesda and even Rockstar to a certain extent have been doing it for ages. Let's not pretend like From Software reinvented the wheel or something. If you open the map of those games, you really don't see much of anything, aside from a few locations you already discovered. There are no specific activities associated with a specific place, you just explore and find out yourself what the world has to offer. And this is what Elden Ring does pretty damn well, letting the player freely explore without spoiling that exploration with excessive markers. The first 20 to 30 hours were among the best I had in an open world in a very long time actually. The amount of enemy variety, bosses, and unique locations made the game a wonder to explore. Unfortunately, the honeymoon period had to come to an end, and more issues and red flags impossible to ignore made me question whether or not the open world was a good idea in the first place. The previous From Software games were mostly semi-linear. You follow the main path to progress, then at a certain point it will branch out into multiple areas. Honestly, it was quite a great mix of linearity, interconnected areas and various paths to explore. This design also gave these games cohesion and a sense of progress, which compensated for the lack of a narrative plot-driven structure. Elden Ring on the other hand, it's an open world, and unfortunately this has an adverse effect on many things the previous games established, becoming at the end of the day way too focused and all over the place. After 40 hours or so of random exploration, trying to find out what I can kill before it kills me, and occasionally following the spawn markers on the map, then hit all sorts of walls because I realized I was way too underleveled, I came to question like, what the hell am I even doing in this game? I didn't feel like I was progressing much towards anything. I was basically just running around killing stuff, farming for runes so I can kill more stuff, which is totally fine for a while, but after a certain point became extremely repetitive and tiresome. Okay, so let's elaborate things a bit. There are three major pillars that support exploration in Elden Ring: level design and unique locations, enemy and bosses variety, and finally loot, items and stuff you find to get better. In terms of locations variety, biomes and stuff like that, Elden Ring might be among the best titles from Software. Big as the world is, there is quite a lot to see. Almost every single type of environment you could think of, you will find it here. Forests, corrupted zones, mountains, hills, swamps, snowy regions, lava zones, and so many others. The game is extremely generous in this regard. The game also has the legacy dungeons, which brings back the multi-layered and interconnected design. Oddly, we haven't seen that much since Dark Souls 1. These are, in my opinion, the best parts from the game, and I really think they succeed to recapture the complexity of the first half of Dark Souls 1 design. On top of that, some of them look really incredible, and even manage to connect different parts of the world. As for the rest of the open world, well, it's a very mixed bag. There are dungeons, ruins, caves, mines and catacombs to explore, but they all look almost identical to each other, with pretty much the same layout and design. They feel extremely copy-pasted, and there are over 50 of these locations. Another issue I have with the open world is how certain areas are connected. After leaving Stormvale Castle, there's this little island that grabbed my attention. I thought, whoa, this looks pretty interesting, I wonder how I get there. I checked the map and I saw this little patch of land that might lead me to that place. But nope, to get there you have to travel all across to Fall Belfries and teleport from there. I mean, I know people praise those chests that teleports the player somewhere else on the map. And honestly, I see their potential to shake up things a bit and surprise the player. The problem I have with them is that oftentimes you end up on a place you can't even engage with due to its difficulty, or it ends up being way too easy, to the point that I managed to crush pretty much everything on my way. So I kinda wish the game used proper scaling in those areas. Anyway, since I mentioned the teleportation, maybe I should also discuss the fast travel. Okay, so the game is very generous in those fast traveling points, to the point that kinda removes that sense of tension and risk when you venture into the open world. Basically you can die and then just spawn to the closest fast travel point, which is usually like a few seconds away. This unfortunately applies well to the legacy dungeons as well. The whole idea of finding shortcuts which connect different areas is greatly diminished by the abundance of fast traveling points. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or better say the elephants, enemies and bosses. You see, the first few dozens of hours can be very deceiving, in a sense that pretty much anywhere you go you see a new type of creatures and monsters that you haven't seen before. The game looks like an ocean of sprawling enemies that await to be challenged, but unfortunately the more I played, the more that first impression started to dissipate, as reality kicked in. The same enemies you found in a specific area of the map and thought they were unique to that place now can be seen in plenty of other regions. This also applies to bosses, which might have an impact when you first discover them, but then later you realize they are all over the place and become regular enemies. So what ultimately happens is bosses become regular enemies and enemies become bosses. Even the so-called unique story bosses repeat a lot, such as Margit. You fight him 2 times, then a 3rd time, but it's Margot now, which has almost the same movesets plus a few extra more. Now I understand from a lore point of view this might make some sense, in the case of Margit and a few others maybe, and if they were the only exception I wouldn't mind that. But this is a very common pattern regardless of lore. Almost every major boss encounter was reused at least 2 times, while other world bosses go as far as over 6 times. Actually, if we take into consideration all of them, only 9 are truly unique. The amount of overused and repeated enemies tend to also have a negative effect on its open world. For example, in Lingrave I encountered bosses that I wasn't able to defeat, so I thought no problem, I will come back later. However, later on I realized those bosses were pretty much in other locations, or they became regular enemies. Therefore, my motivation to return and kill them was greatly diminished by this. Also, enemies are no longer unique to a specific location or region. You will encounter them all over the map. And make no mistake, because this really matters. Having unique enemies associated with a unique location, it's one of those things that gives that place an identity, and makes it at the end of the day more memorable. It seems like From Software made a big open world and then realized they don't have enough content to fill it up with. But the whole reusable enemies and assets go beyond Elden Ring to their previous games. Yeah, they recycled quite a lot of things from those titles as well. From rats, skeletons, dogs, frogs, giants, crabs to whatever these are. Hey, remember these annoying pricks that hang on the wall ceiling? Well, they behave pretty much the same except they have been reskinned. How about Capra demons or these giants gargoyles? Remember these abominations from Dark Souls 3 who don't give a flying fuck about any solid object that stands between you and them? Well, they made a boss fight out of that and you will fight it more than 6 times. I could go on and on with this, but the question is where exactly we draw the line for this. One of the most common arguments in defense of the repeated bosses and enemies was many open world games don't even offer half of the variety of what Elden Ring has to offer. And this is definitely true to a certain degree. However, there are a few things we should take into consideration. If we look at other open world games, let's say Witcher 3, Skyrim, Red Dead Redemption 2, all of these games have a world that is more or less spread apart, and the space between enemies encounters and bosses is filled with towns and villages, where basically you can spend hours just interacting with the NPCs and doing all sorts of crazy things. On top of that, you have quests and missions to follow, and between them you might encounter all sorts of random events. Now, I'm not saying enemy variety or repeated bosses is not an issue present in other open world games, but it kinda feels less obvious since there's a significant amount of time spent doing other stuff. But in Elden Ring, this repetition is more problematic, mainly because there isn't much to do aside from running around, killing stuff, and then farm runes so you can kill more stuff. So when bosses like Erdtree and many others are reused like dozens of times, it becomes very apparent and distracting. The game suffers quite a lot from offering the player multiple gameplay scenarios or variations that will break this repetition. Anyway, let's see how these boss fights are at the end of the day. Well, they're not good. Actually, they might be among my least favorite from what From Software made until this point. There are a few major problems that are pretty hard to ignore, and I have no freaking idea how the so-called critics and reviewers just let it slide. First, bosses and some of the enemies move way too fast, and are too aggressive, like Sekiro type. However, unlike Sekiro, the combat in Elden Ring is pretty much the same as it was in Dark Souls, maybe with a few extra movesets. This creates a weird disconnect where you see bosses and enemies jumping and spinning into the air from one corner to another, having multiple types of attacks in a row. Meanwhile, all I can do is just... It's very apparent since Bloodborne, enemies have gotten more and more aggressive, with a peak being Sekiro, but in those games the combat has been adjusted to work in tandem with the new style. Which brings me to the next point, which is one-hit kill bullshit. There were so many instances where enemies, and especially bosses, have a special type of attack, a combo or a stun attack that makes you pull your hair off. I'm talking more specifically about one-hit kill or one-hit and almost kill, followed by another quick attack. But since you don't really have that much time to react, since you can barely understand what the fuck is going on due to the damn camera or how quick enemies move, or maybe they just have a long chain of attack that ends up in a guaranteed death. And I think because of that, many players will have no problem trying any possible way to cheat and exploit their way out of many fights using broken builds. It's no longer a matter of how to get good, but rather how to exploit. And speaking of exploitation, there are a few examples when bosses have quite a difficult time adjusting their behavior to the open world. When they start following you and they move a bit from their initial starting point, well, you might be surprised to see them vanishing into the thin air and respawn to their initial location. This makes bosses extremely easy to exploit, since almost at any time I can just exit their roaming area and come back. The weird thing about this is that it can happen even in closed areas. They simply vanish for a minute or two for some reason. I guess they need to catch a break or something? There are a few more issues that plague bosses and enemies in Elden Ring. First is the damn camera. I know this was an issue in every single game they've made, but somehow Elden Ring might be the worst From Software game they made on this regards. What aggravates things so badly is the size of many bosses combined with the speed and different types of attacks. Large bosses, for example, can be intimidating and offer quite a spectacle. However, the way you engage with them can be quite underwhelming and annoying at the same time. Running around them and hitting their knees or finger toes while watching their life bar decreasing, but also having to manage the damn camera is in my opinion quite frustrating, and not in a good, challenging kind of way. I really wished at this point From Software developed more interesting systems to make this large boss fight more engaging, and less like you have to fight with the game at the same time. Among the worst contenders might be the dragons, which are pretty terrible to fight overall, especially when you can't use the horse. Sekiro was probably the best when it comes to handling large enemies. The camera was distant enough so you don't lose sight of the whole fight, and the grappling hook added an element of verticality to the combat, which is so badly needed to a From Software game. Anyway, another issue in Elden Ring is the hitbox, enemies and bosses hitting through the walls and solid objects. I can't even remember how many times I died or got hit in such ways. This was already a problem in their previous games, but in Elden Ring it's probably the worst. Another issue I have is the placement of some of these boss encounters, which is just weird. Some arenas are just way too small while the monsters are way too big, or simply the terrain doesn't really allow to freely move without stumbling into objects. And lastly, the cherry on top when it comes to bosses is the duo or trio fights. Remember how much crap Dark Souls 2 got for this, and deservedly so. Fighting 2 or 3 bosses at the same time does not play into the series' strength, the fights rather become too chaotic and all over the place. But Dark Souls 1 and 3 somehow managed to find a balance by complementing their movesets. One will be slower while the other one much faster. On the other hand, what Elden Ring does is just mind-baffling. It takes the same bosses or enemies you fought like dozens of times and pairs them together without any consideration, whether they work together or not. Many fights become just a tedious slog where you're kinda pushed into a corner or in a very defensive position. Personally, I hated every single duo or trio encounter like this, especially the Godskin duo. You cannot fathom how much I hated this encounter. Okay, so the last pillar of exploration is discovering items, weapons and spells and stuff like that. I wish I could praise the game for this, but again, the open world kinda ruins many things I liked about their previous games. The linearity of Dark Souls was more beneficial when it comes to finding weapons, gear, spells, since the level design was more tight and compact overall, which provided the player with more useful items at a more constant rate for the build they chose. But now Elden Ring, it's an open world, which makes everything way more spread apart and difficult to find. So when you eventually find something or is given to you by an NPCs or a boss you just defeated, there is a very high chance you won't be able to use it. The problem resides not only in its open world, but also how the character progression and leveling up works. You see, every weapon and spell in Elden Ring is gated behind certain stats. You can't use it until you invest enough points into those stats. So this philosophy design can be boiled down to buy before you try. Basically, you invest points into something that you might not even enjoy using it at the end of the day. Now, I know there is this whole obsession with builds people have. However, another thing that must be taken into consideration is the open world aspect of Elden Ring, which should reward the player for taking their times to explore. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to get rid of builds, but I think the creation process should be more flexible. For example, in Skyrim you can still create a build, but the creation process is more flexible and organic. Also, items and weapons you find are not gated behind stats, so when you explore a dungeon for 20 minutes and find stuff or weapons outside of your specialty, you can still use them. You can still experiment with it for a while, even though you won't be as efficient as opposed to someone who invested time into those types of weapons. So what I think ultimately, the progression in Elden Ring should be readjusted and even redesigned, not just to create builds but also to reward exploration, since it's also an open world. Okay, let's move on to combat and game balance, which is almost non-existent by the way in this game. The combat in Elden Ring is pretty much the same as it was in Dark Souls 3 and the previous games. And look, considering it's a new IP, am I wrong by asking a little bit more? Because after 4 games in the series, I feel like the combat doesn't really hold up anymore as it used to. Don't get me wrong, I did not expect a Sekiro-like combat, but I was really excited where From Software is going to take their new IP. Unfortunately, they settled for mediocrity. After finishing Elden Ring, I went back to Sekiro, and I almost forgot how much I loved the combat in that game, but also made me realize some of the issues I had with Souls combat in general. You see, despite having the option to create multiple builds, the way you approach fights, especially boss fights, it's pretty much the same for everyone. It basically can be boiled down to roll, wait for a window of opportunity to hit a few times, then rinse and repeat. There is a bit of a disconnect where bosses kinda do their own thing and routine, while I'm just dancing around them waiting to finish. Now, don't get me wrong, I did enjoy this type of combat for a while, and also I don't want to take the element of challenge and difficulty that comes with that. However, at the same time, this approach to combat became extremely stale for me, since it really doesn't have much depth to it. Now contrast that with Sekiro, which throws you right there into the middle of the storm. The fights are so much more confrontational, eye to eye, neck to neck with the boss. Also, there is this misconception around Sekiro. Simply because you don't have builds, well, you don't have options to kill enemies and bosses. Which is nonsense. The amount of movesets combined with the prosthetics makes Sekiro probably the most varied game they ever made in terms of combat. Anyway, I digress. Back to Elden Ring. There are a few extra elements that have been carried from the previous games, such as jumping and stealth. And while I enjoy finally having the ability to jump in a Souls-like game and occasionally approach stealth for a few enemies, these elements are nowhere as prevalent and developed as in Sekiro. In stealth mode there is no indicator for detection, which makes it very inconsistent overall, and that's also because many times you're being spotted even though you're not supposed to. What? How the fuck did he saw me? Oh, god damn it. There is also no ability to strike from above or below, and the occasions to be stealthy are extremely limited just to a few areas, which is a real shame because having the options to approach more situations like that, and even maybe have various scenarios where stealth is recommended, could really offer a nice change in pacing. The addition of Ashes of War should expand the combat and make the player experiment a bit more. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad they exist, and some of them are really useful. Also, I really like the fact that you can experiment a bit more with magic, even though you may not intend to create a mage build. However, there are a few issues. First, you can only equip one per weapon, because God forbid have extra movesets besides standard and heavy attack. Aside from that, you can only equip Ashes to a Site of Grace for some reason, and I don't understand why they decided to do that. Summoning help can be changed on the fly as you explore, and you're even able to equip more than one. But for Ashes of War they decided to restrict the player to only one. Also, these ashes can't be used to special weapons. And honestly, it doesn't even make any sense. I should be able to equip at least some ashes regardless of weapons. The last problem with Ashes of War that I have is the balancing. Some ashes are way too overpowered, to the point they kinda trivialize many fights. You can basically just spam the same ability over and over, and kill almost every boss you encounter in this way. Now let's talk about the damn horse. When it comes to exploration, it does serve its purpose. You can move rather quickly across the map, the double jump is a nice addition that I really like. Being able to just hop around adds an extra layer of verticality. Also, I liked how quickly you can summon it, and then just jump off the horse really fast. That being said, I cannot express how much I hate how they implemented the horse combat in this game. First, the combat is extremely basic. You have a normal attack and a charge attack, and that's it. For a game where you spend so much time riding, it's insane how limited the combat is. Basically, most fights can be summed up to run around the boss and look for small windows of opportunity, then repeat the same process over and over until the fight is over. Would have been so damn cool if Torrent, which is the name of the horse by the way, also had some special attacks, for example leave a trail of fire behind or lighting or poise. Or how about some customization options, like some armor pieces that would make it more resistant, or how about the ability to block attacks. There are so many things they could have done with it, but there are even more problems about the horse which involve the damn camera. You see, the direction in which Torrent moves is directly linked to the camera, which is not inherently bad. However, the problem resides when you try to keep enemies or bosses in the frame while moving into a specific direction, which by the way cannot be done without changing the course direction of the horse. Other games such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla, changing the camera angle does not instantly change your direction. Actually, it's done in such a way which allows you to keep track of your surroundings while still moving forward. In Elden Ring, this cannot be done without changing the horse direction, which makes many fights, especially with bosses, very annoying. But hey, that's why you have the locked on option, right? Well, let's open that can of worms, shall we? First, trying to use this option really sucks many times, since not only locks on enemies and bosses, but also small animals that hide among the grass and bushes. This makes targeting sometimes a specific enemy a nightmare. What makes things even worse is the fact that the button assigned to the option to lock on enemies is the same as resetting the camera from behind. So in those situations when I wasn't close enough to the enemy I wanted to target, the camera just switched behind me. Whoever thought this was a good idea should be fired. I wish I could stop here, but there are a few more things I want to mention, such as the camera being too close and in your face, which makes it very easy to get stuck behind objects and not be able to see what's coming in front of you. Also, if you fall off the horse, there are very high chances of death, since it takes forever to get up, and you don't benefit from invincibility frames. And considering how aggressive many times bosses are, well, you will die a lot because of this shit. But if somehow you manage to get up before getting hit like 100 times, guess what, the game throws a freaking menu screen in your face asking you whether or not you're sure you want to revive your horse. Because surely that's the very first thing you want to be doing after getting back on your feet. Confirm you want your horse back and not die. If I were to describe the horse in this game, it's more like a death from 1,000 cuts. None of these issues individually may ruin your game, but all together makes it honestly for a very frustrating and annoying experience that oftentimes made me want to pull my hair off. Another big issue that is baffling how many people so easily overlook or downplay is the game balance. This is an issue pretty much in every single open world RPG to a various degree, and unfortunately Elden Ring really sucks at this. Let's take for example Limgrave, which is the starting area. At the beginning there were plenty of difficulty spikes and enemies I couldn't beat, so I decided to leave those for later. After 60 hours or so I returned and I pretty much decimated any enemy that stood in my way, including bosses. For a little while it kinda felt good, I have to admit, but then I realized I wasn't having much fun. I was expecting to defeat enemies easier than before, but not really that easy if you know what I mean. The lack of any significant challenge combined with the repeated enemies and bosses kind of discouraged me to explore areas I may have missed, especially in the early game. Also the amount of runes I was getting was insanely low, like 24 to 100 per kill, but the lack of balance goes beyond just Limgrave. Even important bosses that should be intimidating and challenging were just a joke for me. Like Redon for example, that I just killed in less than a minute in my first try. I think some sort of scaling should be in place, because I felt like I just broke the game, simply because I decided to explore more than the game expected of me. Then you have the late game area, which is the opposite. Enemies deal so much freaking damage that no matter how long my health bar is, it was never enough. 2 or 3 hits or a chain of attacks and I'm dead, like what the hell. Which brings me to the next topic of summons. I have very mixed feelings about this. On paper, they should serve as an extra help when you need them, but honestly I ended up using them more than I initially wanted to, and here are a few reasons why. Considering how aggressive bosses are and how they are designed, you kinda have to use them. I feel like many of these encounters were designed with summons in mind, which is very weird since this breaks the entire fight where you no longer have to study the patterns, you just summon a distraction and then you hide behind the boss, especially for magic builds which ultimately turn many fights into a complete joke. Actually, in some cases the summons can do the entire job for you. Another reason for me using them so often was, well, most of the bosses are really not that interesting and tend to repeat quite a lot, so I was really not that invested in fighting them alone. I was more like, another one? I might as well just get it over with and see what's behind it. Many fights were so tedious and annoying that I just gave up and summoned. The game was just wasting my time at that point. Okay, now let's discuss a few other things like the UI and UX. Now, there has been a bit of a buzz created by a developer which criticized the UX of Elden Ring, and people's response was usually memes like this one, which honestly makes it pretty obvious people really don't know what's the difference between these two, UI and UX. Okay, so the first one stands for stuff you see on screen, such as icons, menus and other things. You know, the overall interface. UX on the other hand refers to how you interact with these elements and how intuitive everything is. And honestly, the truth being told, the UX kinda sucks in Elden Ring. For a game that wants me to read item descriptions, why on earth I can't do that immediately after picking up an item? Instead, I have to waste time searching for the damn item among other dozens I have in my inventory. Changing spells, especially during combat, really sucks as well, since I have to swipe through each one that I have assigned, until I finally find the one that I really want to use. Now, don't get me wrong, I still believe it's a rather cheap shot to say how could Elden Ring be a 10 out of 10 when the UX sucks. Which it does, but considering how many other issues the game has, well, that would be probably among my list. Okay, now moving on to a few other small things. First, there are these cheap gacha moments, where enemies just hide behind a wall waiting to attack. It's okay for a few times, but it happens quite often. And just like a jump scare in a movie that is overused, it becomes really annoying. The use of bows and arrows is still rather crappy. I don't understand why they didn't took the Demon's Souls remake approach and have the camera over the shoulder, rather than this weird zoom in which sucks so bad if you aim for precision. Another weird thing is when the game suddenly decides, well, you no longer have those statues placed next to the boss fights, instead you have to backtrack all the way through hordes of enemies so you can get to the boss arena again. It's very, very strange and I have no idea why they decided to do that. I guess that's it. Elden Ring is a game that I have very mixed feelings. On the one hand, the open world is better than many Ubisoft-like open worlds game we've seen recently, and really creates a sense of adventure and exploration at least in the first few hours. But I can't feel it was also kind of a mistake that generated way too many problems that were inexistent before or aggravated by the open world.